I'm Derek Fortini, director of the Estes Park Museum. Today I'll be interviewing Fire Chief David Wolf. The date is September 21st, 2021. We are at the Estes Park Museum. Please state your name, birthday, and where you were born.
Yeah, David Wolf, November 22nd, 1982, and born in Cheverly, Maryland.
Great, and what brought you to Estes Park?
So I moved here in 2016 for this job. So I started in the volunteer fire service in 2000 when I was a freshman in college. Remained active as a volunteer through my undergraduate, my master's, and my PhD, which were all in geology. And then I moved down to Houston, Texas to work for an oil company as a research scientist. And in the time I was down there working in oil, I was also volunteering and then started working part-time for the fire department running the training program for a large combination department. And then I had kids, and it got to the point where I had a full-time job in the fire service and family, and I had time for two of them, and something had to go. And wife and I talked about it and decided that we were interested in moving to a different part of the country for raising our family and looking to get full-time into the fire service, and the timing just happened to be right to land the position here. So I moved here in June of 2016 as the fire chief.
And then before we get to the 2020 forest fires, can you give a little bit of background of your experience fighting fires?
Sure. So my background in the fire service was starting in Pennsylvania as a volunteer in 2000. Spent time there as a volunteer, as a rescue scuba diver, hazmat, doing all hazards work in Pennsylvania, and then continued on in a volunteer department in New York. And working there, again, all hazard stuff, but not a lot of wildland. Moved down to Texas, spent 6 years in a large combination department there that bordered the city of Houston. So we covered 400,000 residents and running a significant volume of all hazards calls, from train wrecks to oil storage fires to all the normal stuff that you would think about. And then since 2016 here in Estes, increased amount of wildland fires and rope rescue type of calls, fewer high-rise fires, but sort of that all hazards background from 4 different states.
And I know our local fire department, they provide a lot of services.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are always curious about how much are they trained on wildfires versus structural fires.
Mm-hmm. So the way our members are trained is based on what we think the risks are for our community. So looking at historically what kind of calls we've run, what kind of threats we anticipate, that really is what drives our training program. So our volunteers have a range in training from certified as wildland firefighters under the same National Wildfire Coordinating Group guidelines that everybody uses. They're trained in structural firefighting, trained in motor vehicle crashes and medical response. And then some members go on and do more advanced training in technical rescue, rope rescue, swift water, ice rescue, all the other disciplines that you can think of. But we do a lot of training in both wildland and structure, given that both risks exist here. We do a lot of joint training with our neighboring departments, both with Rocky Mountain National Park and the U.S. Forest Service, as well as with our neighboring volunteer and career departments. And we actually run a regional fire academy here out of Estes for all the volunteer agencies that border us, so everybody trains together for their wildland and their structural certifications initially. And that training's given us a good opportunity to build those relationships and know what each other's capable of, so that when we do respond together, we're a little bit more comfortable working together.
And I know it probably fluctuates, but how big is the fire department right now?
We're around 35 volunteers, and we have 7 full-time employees.
So we'll start talking about the Cameron Peak and East Troublesome fires.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go ahead and start with the Cameron Peak fire. Do you recall when it started and when our fire department got involved with that?
Yeah, Cameron Peak fire was first reported in the afternoon of August 13th, 2020. It very quickly grew up to around 500 acres, and a call was put out by the U.S. Forest Service and Larimer County to get additional resources. That night was the first night of our fire academy for 2020, so we were teaching class that night. We got a request for an engine to go support the initial attack on that fire. So around 8 o'clock, we loaded up an engine crew and drove up to Chambers Lake to join the initial attack. We had engines up there operating from August 13th, the day it started, until about the 16th. By August 16th, Cameron Peak had jumped over Highway 14 and was then south of Highway 14. The incident was transitioning from local management team to a Type 2 incident management team that was coming in. And around that point, our resources were released from the fire initially, came back to Estes. But obviously not the last time we were engaged with the fire. So we started then throughout late August, early September. We had various times that units would go up to Highway 14, Poudre Canyon area to assist, including on the smaller Bluestone fire that was near Risk Canyon, as well as helping out with the Cameron Peak fire itself as it moved east across Highway 14 and down sort of the canyon towards Rustic. So we typically would send crews up a couple of days at a time to assist. With a mostly volunteer force, it was a little bit challenging to send people out for a full standard 14-day deployment, but we would send people up when we could to assist whatever needs they had, which was mostly doing structure protection, prepping homes in case the fire got there, or then defending homes as fire arrived around those houses. Once we got to around Labor Day weekend, there was a big wind push from the north that pushed the fire down into Rocky Mountain National Park on the northwest side. And we were worried about the fire pushing down the Poudre Canyon drainage and towards Chapin Pass. So at that point, I was working really closely with Mike Llewellyn, who's the fire management officer for Rocky Mountain National Park, with the incident management team, with some of our other partners to evaluate when we were worried about what the fire could do, what our triggers would look like if we needed to start evacuations on the northwest side of town, and what our strategy would be if the fire did push down that way. So a lot of those things were set over Labor Day weekend, and fortunately September 7th or September 8th, we got a snowstorm that checked the fire up and stopped it there. So then we were able to continue monitoring it, but not having to worry as much about that fire pushing down. So then we had a bit of a break between mid-September and mid-October. And then in mid-October, the Cameron Peak fire kicked back up in the Pingree Park area, CSU campus. And once that started to burn south, on October 14th, we got a call from the incident management team that they wanted to evacuate Glen Haven, that they were worried about the fire pushing down there. So starting on October 14th, our Estes Valley again was engaged, working within the Glen Haven area, assisting with evacuations, working hand in hand with the Glen Haven Fire Department. And then by October 17th, the fire had burned into Glen Haven and was starting to burn around houses. So we were directly involved with structure protection, conducting burnout operations around homes to try and stop the fire and check it up where we could. And then we continued to support on the Cameron Peak fire all the way up until the morning of October 22nd, when the East Troublesome fire was reported as jumping over the divide. And at that point, our resources essentially disengaged from Cameron Peak and were then fully engaged on East Troublesome.
How large is the Glen Haven Fire Department?
I don't know how many volunteers they currently have. I think they're somewhere around 20 volunteers. I think in a normal year, they run somewhere between 30 and 50 calls. So they're 100% volunteer, entirely funded through donations, mostly through their pancake breakfast that they run in the fall every year. And so this is a considerable size event for a community their scale.
You were talking about assisting with the Cameron Peak fire. I recall a consistent story coming out was the accessibility and trying to get back there to actually fight it.
Mm-hmm.
What was realistic to approach and how to do that. Can you relate to that at all, especially by sending some of our local firefighters down
Mm-hmm.
there to assist with it?
Sure. So when we were engaged with the Cameron Peak fire, especially up on the Highway 14 area early on, access was always a challenge. No matter what type of apparatus we took, range of types of apparatus. If you asked a kindergartner to draw a fire engine, they would draw what's called a Type 1 fire engine. And then they go from that all the way down to things that are on a pickup truck chassis. And even with pickup truck chassis and Forest Service roads and access, most things could not be accessed by vehicle. So we had to send crews in on foot to access and engage directly with where the fire was. So a lot of the resources that we were sending were staying closer to the roads and closer to the structures to do work preparing structures. But a lot of that area is national forest or it's wilderness area, and it's incredibly inaccessible. Part of the challenges we were having as the fire was pushing down into Chapin Pass in early September. In that corner of the park, It's very remote. There are hiking trails, but it takes a long time to get to where you could engage with the fire. It's still a very large fire front that you're dealing with, a lot of miles of terrain. And there's a lot of beetle kill and standing dead trees that make engaging those areas very unsafe for firefighters, because not only were we worried about the fire itself, but we're worried about standing dead timber that could fall down and winds that could injure firefighters. And if someone were to get injured, it's very hard to get them out of there and to evacuate them to safety. So a lot of the conversations that are going on about where to engage have to do with probability of success. What's the probability that we can engage productively, have the outcome that we want without getting anybody hurt, and weighing that possibility of success against the risk to the people that we're putting into those environments. While also thinking about the long-term risks. If we do nothing, where's the fire going to go? Does that now make it to a spot where one wind event and it's threatening a community of 30,000, 40,000 people? And so those things are often being weighed. And that's where those conversations are happening between multiple team leads and agency representatives, between federal agencies, local agencies, state agencies, the incident management team, everybody that might have skin in the game to make sure everyone's concerns and views are being represented.
And you were talking about when the fire started to come towards Chapin Pass, in the north side of the park. Was the concern that it would come actually over Chapin Pass, or is it more of a thought that it would probably go more to the east, follow the fuel, and then still come into Estes from the north side? Did you consider the tree line kind of this natural barrier, so it maybe come more to the east?
So the general consensus was that the tundra was going to be a natural barrier to the east. So we weren't as concerned with the fire moving eastward and over the divide, although obviously, as we learned with East Troublesome, some of those assumptions were flawed. Our primary concern was that the fire was going to continue to the south through Chapin Pass, come over Chapin's Pass itself, into the Fall River drainage around Old Fall River Road. And then the predominant wind direction is out of the west-northwest 95% of the time. And if it got into that Old Fall River drainage, there were no good spots to try and stop the fire within that drainage, and the wind was naturally going to blow it down towards the alluvial fan, past Sheep Ponds, and towards Fall River Road and into the town of Estes Park that way. So that was our primary concern during that time, was that the fire was going to come down through Chapin Pass and then work its way down behind, just being pushed by the wind through that continuous fuel. A lot of the fires came a lot closer than I think people realized. Like, we were very concerned about, we had trigger set for when we were going to evacuate Fall River Road in September. And then the fire stopped, so we didn't have to evacuate it. And then we had trigger set for Cameron Peak coming down through Glen Haven. We had trigger set for East Troublesome, and all of them were triggered at the same time, which is why we evacuated the whole town all at once. So.
Okay. Well, that's interesting, talking about trigger points. How do you go about setting those, and how far in advance were those already set? Like, before the fire even started, did you?
No, so I guess taking a jump back to 2017. So in 2017, the Chimney Tops 2 fire burned from Smoky Mountain National Park out of the national park into the surrounding gateway communities in Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And Mike Llewellyn, the fire management officer for Rocky, was part of the investigative team for the National Park Service that went and looked at those incidents to understand what happened, what kind of lessons should be learned. And when he came back to Estes, and we sat down and said, well, could that happen here? And of course the answer was yes. We recognized that this threat could exist. So in 2017, we had a workshop of everybody that would be involved in fighting a large-scale wildfire on a scale that we've never seen before. It included our federal partners from the forest and the park, our state partners through the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, our local partners from local fire departments, ambulance districts, law enforcement, dispatch, all talking about how would we deal with an incident here in Estes Park. We built some models where we started with a 10-acre fire in the eastern part of the park around the Eagle Cliff area, and we put typical September weather behind it. And in those models, what we found is that a fire could burn from Eagle Cliff to Fish Creek in about 4 hours. So in the span of 4 hours, it could burn across town with that kind of weather. So that prompted a lot of conversations about, well, how would we respond to an incident like this? Prioritizing evacuations, recognizing what kind of critical infrastructure needs to be protected. How do we manage an evacuation of a hospital, protect our radio communications, all of the different things that need to happen, and identifying who would be responsible for those. So after the 2017 workshop, we realized we needed some things like traffic management plans and plans on hospital evacuations and how we would execute those. And we built those through 2017 and 2018. And in 2019, we all got back together to revisit that plan and look at it and say, do we need to make any changes to our plan? Do we need to make any updates? How much progress have we made on the things that we identified are problems? And then we expanded that conversation into how do we prevent a fire like this? How do we remain resilient through an incident like this? And how do we recover if an incident like this were to happen? And a lot of those plans came together and then identified more actions to take in 2020, which none of us got to in 2020 because of COVID and because of the fires. But a lot of the planning that happened back then helped us determine where trigger points need to be, how early do we need to start thinking about evacuations. The experiences that other communities have had with evacuations, looking at communities like Paradise and Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg, told us that in a community like ours with the number of roads that we have, we can evacuate around 5,000 people an hour. So we can estimate how many people might be here in a typical summer day, 10,000 full-time residents, 40,000 overnight guests, and then daytime visitation somewhere in the 20 to 40,000 people in a very busy September day. And you start doing the math on how many people do I need to get out of the way, how quickly is the fire going to move, and then you set evacuation points based on that. So coming back to 2020 and thinking about September, those models were all in our head about where do we need to set our triggers, how early do we need to start evacuating. We're not going to wait until the fire's at the entrance booths to start evacuating. But it's also based on future weather conditions. You don't want to start evacuating if snow's coming the next day and it's going to stop the fire, and now we've evacuated people unnecessarily. And so those are another thing that's a lot of conversations happening throughout the event. Where's the fire going? Where do we want to set trigger points? What would change those trigger points? And based on the current weather predictions, this is where we want to evacuate. And if the weather gets worse or the weather gets better, then we'll move those lines. So those lines are getting drawn on somewhat at the time of the event, because at the time of the event is when you know what the actual problem is. But the conversations about how we would decide where to draw them had happened years previous.
And before that took place in 2017, were there any other plans before that period? Or
there were not. We didn't have formalized plans, but there was an incredible amount of fire experience and fire history within the valley. We have people, like I mentioned, our fire management officer for the park and the forest had both been in their roles for decades and had a lot of local knowledge between all of the agencies that had experienced local wildfires, people who had been involved back with the Big Elk Fire in 2003. And so we had a lot of local knowledge, but we hadn't formalized it. And that was one of the points, was knowing that people change. We get new people into these roles. How do we bring that person up to speed about what our risks look like here in the Estes Valley, understanding what challenges we might face so that we don't have to start every emergency with a new plan. And that was a big part of the planning that was happening back in 2017.
I just have to say, the fact that you can take those things on and have that foresight and the amount of variables you work with, and on top of providing all of your day-to-day services as it is, it's nothing less than admirable. It's incredible.
No, and while I appreciate that, one of the amazing things as we've looked back on that is we tried to imagine the worst case scenario we could, and we came up with a 7,000 acre fire. And then we had 400,000 acres burn around us. So we still weren't pessimistic enough. But I'm still glad that we had the plans that we did.
You talk about working with other local fire departments.
Mm-hmm.
When you say that, how far out does that go? Like, does it include Loveland? Is it beyond Loveland?
Yeah. So Estes Valley Fire has formal mutual aid agreements with every agency that borders us, and then a little bit further out. So that includes Glen Haven to the north, Loveland, Pinewood Springs, Big Elk Volunteer Fire Department, Lyons Fire, and Allens Park Fire. And then as well as our federal partners, Rocky Mountain National Park and the U.S. Forest Service, and with the State of Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control, and then Larimer County Sheriff's Office, which has their own emergency services branch that does some swiftwater, wildland, and search and rescue. But then we have, without the formal agreements, we still do a lot of conversations and trainings at the state level. So one of the things that I've been involved with for the last couple of years, the Colorado State Fire Chiefs has a number of different sections that worry about volunteer departments, combination departments, wildland threats. So something that we had been working on since 2018 is a statewide mutual aid system, so that when a community like Estes Park is having the worst day of their lives and they need more help than they can get locally, or all those agencies are also having a bad day and are tied up, how we can put that call out and get lots of engines very quickly. And so that was something that we had been working on since 2018. The legislation for that passed in 2020 through Senate Bill 166, which allowed us to be able to do some of those. And so while that wasn't fully formalized by the time our challenges hit us in 2020, a lot of that planning had again already started taking place. A lot of those relationships were built. And when we get into talking about East Troublesome, we'll talk about how we utilize some of those things that were coming from even the state planning level. Not knowing we were the ones that were going to need it when we designed the system, but we were beneficiaries of it.
Okay, so you introduced it a little bit, East Troublesome Fire, and the date October 22nd. Why don't we go ahead and get into how that kind of, when it was viewed as an initial threat, and where was the turning point for that fire?
There. On October 21st, so East Troublesome Fire started on October 14th, and for days skunked around, didn't really move very much. And then on October 21st, it had a major wind event over in Grand County that pushed that fire over 100,000 acres in one day. And 100,000 acres is a pretty hard number to wrap your head around. The Estes Valley Fire Protection District is 70 square miles, and that's 45,000 acres. So it burned an area the size of our fire protection district almost 3 times over in an afternoon, blowing across, and was moving considerable number of miles per hour as it came across and into the Rocky Mountain National Park. And then as it burned into the national park, it burned up the west side of the divide. And the conventional wisdom was that the Continental Divide was wide enough that we didn't have to worry about it. But we had also seen fire behavior that no one had seen or experienced before when it comes to rate of growth. On the morning of October 22nd, we didn't know that the fire had come over the divide yet. There were rumors that it had possibly spotted over into the Spruce Creek drainage on the east side of Rocky Mountain National Park, but we didn't know. So a lot of the Estes resources that morning continued to go to the briefing for Glenhaven, went down into the Glenhaven area to try and help with the operations that were still going on there related to Cameron Peak, because we still had Dunraven Glade Road as the trigger point for starting evacuations in northern Estes Valley. And we were holding the fire right on that road at that point. So we were still working down in Glenhaven to try and support. I got a call from Mike Llewellyn sometime on the morning of the 22nd that reported that a satellite over the equator had picked up a heat signature in the Spruce Creek drainage, which is always concerning because you never want to hear that heat's big enough that a satellite over the equator can see things happening in Estes. We also knew that those satellites can pick up a lot of heat in the smoke cloud itself that isn't necessarily heat on the ground. So it was quite a few hours before we were able to get boots on the ground to confirm that we did have fire on the east side of the divide. There was a lot of conversations early about when do we start evacuations, when do we worry about whether or not the fire's here. And we didn't want to start evacuations until we knew we had fire on our side of the divide. So that was around 11:30 that we finally got confirmation of fire in the Spruce Creek drainage. And at that point, it was burning down towards the Fern Lake burn scar on the back side of Mount Wah. And so we knew we had fire there. At that point, all the Estes resources, including myself, pulled out of Glenhaven, and I reported to the Emergency Operations Center, which was set up at the Event Center, tied in with Eric Rose, captain from the Estes Park Police Department and town's emergency manager. And we started to build out our organizational structure for planning to deal with this in the Estes Valley and our communities. A lot of these conversations have been happening over the last week. How do we decide what the trigger points are going to be for the Cameron Peak fire? How far out should we draw them? So a lot of these things that we had been doing as planning for the Cameron Peak fire, now we're able to pivot to what was going on with East Troublesome. But it happened relatively fast on the 22nd. In an ideal world, evacuation of a community is going to look like a lot like evacuating and getting people off an airplane, where you move people out of the way first, and then the people behind them are able to move. It's nice and orderly. You have lots of time so that people at the back aren't being pushed by fire by the time they need to evacuate. And that's great in planning. And once a fire comes over 1.5 miles of tundra, all of those things get recalibrated on how much time you think you have. So at 12:30, we started our evacuations of the Highway 66 corridor, all of the YMCA, everything from essentially the Beaver Meadows entrance station out to the west. Mostly because that's a dead-end road. They only had one way in and out of that area. So we started with that evacuation because that was where the fire was most likely to go first, based on where it was and the expected weather. By 1:30, we had started evacuation of the Fall River area. And while that wasn't where we expected the fire to hit first, we knew we couldn't send them to the west up and over the Continental Divide to evacuate. And therefore, they only had one way in and out, which is why we wanted to evacuate that area next. And unfortunately, the time between when we put areas on voluntary evacuations and then escalated them to mandatory evacuations was relatively short because of how quickly the fire was moving and from our 2017 models of how quickly we expected the fire to move. So it was between 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We had ordered a mandatory evacuation for all of the Estes Valley, which is not something that had ever been done before and not something we're ever hoping to have to do again. But we had ordered that full evacuation and started to send people out of town. One of the big challenges that was very apparent to us in hindsight was in the 5 days preceding October 22nd, every road in and out of Estes Park had been closed for some reason. County Road 43 to the north was closed because of the Cameron Peak fire. Highway 34 had been closed on and off because of the Cameron Peak fire. Highway 36 and Highway 7 had both been closed because of the Calwood fire. 72 was closed because of the Left-Hand fire. And Trail Ridge Road was closed because of snow and then was closed because of the East Troublesome fire. And so the people that are now trying to evacuate don't realize what roads are available or are not available to them, which causes people to funnel to the most commonly traveled roads, Highway 36 and Highway 34, and which increased the amount of traffic that we were experiencing. We worked really closely with all of our law enforcement partners, Estes Park Police, Rocky Mountain National Park Law, Larimer County Sheriffs, and Colorado State Patrol. All played instrumental roles in helping manage that evacuation and manage that traffic. The CDOT was helpful in closing the canyons early around 12 o'clock. CDOT closed the canyons at the bottom so no one else could come up and only traffic was coming down. And then Colorado State Patrol utilized Highway 34, both lanes going downhill. And so instead of it being one lane each way, they used both lanes to go down. Highway 36 and Highway 7, we kept one lane open coming up for emergency vehicles to come into the Estes Valley. So by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd ordered an evacuation of everybody in town, and we're trying to flood resources into the valley to be prepared for how we might need to engage with the fire, depending on what it did next. Based on the plan that we built in 2017, we got a strike team of engines out of Glenhaven, a strike team of 6 engines, happened to be engines from the Denver Fire Department that we pulled out of Glenhaven and put protecting the hospital so we can manage the evacuation, knowing evacuation of a hospital will take considerably longer. We don't have enough ambulances in the valley to evacuate all the critical patients and transport people out that way. We had resources that were going to protect the radio towers on top of Prospect Mountain. And then all other resources were committed to helping with evacuations, notifying everybody that an evacuation was needed and trying to provide guidance on where to go. A typical non-COVID October day, we could have expected anywhere from 50 to 80,000 people in town. Two of the really fortunate things that benefited us that day is we think there was only between 30 to 40,000 people in town because of decreased tourism during COVID, air quality, some of the other fire things going on. The other thing that was a big benefit for us is that school had been canceled that day because of air quality. So instead of having to find a way to reunify 1,000 students with their families, they were already home. And so those were two things that really did work in our favor. From the time that we ordered the first evacuation to what we would consider the end of the evacuation phase and everybody had cleared the valley, took us on around 6 hours, which was right in line with what our 2017 plan had estimated on how many people we could move in a given amount of time. As was mentioned, we were also very fortunate in that our models had the fire blowing right through town. We were expecting it to come down Moraine Avenue. And the wind that blew over the Continental Divide was blowing so hard from Grand County that it was causing an eddy in the area of that shelf around Bierstadt Lake. And so the fire came over Mount Wooa and then checked up and stopped and held there considerably longer than any of us thought it would, which worked out to our favor because that gave us time to get everybody out of the path before anything else happened. So that was all the afternoon of October 22nd. We had stood up our emergency operations center. We continued to work with the incident management team, who was then doing a lot of structure preparation on homes that we thought were going to be impacted first. And we knew we had more big wind events coming over the 23rd and the 24th. We were expecting snow in a couple of days, but something has to blow that snow into town. And that wind front is what we were worried about. So it was on the 23rd when I'm at home, I get a call at 8 o'clock at night of someone who thinks they see the fire pushing down towards the YMCA campus. So I went and picked up Eric Rose at his house. We drove out into the park to try and see what was going on, talked with resources from the incident management team, the local division, the local operations, the night operations, about what we thought was going to happen, when we thought it was going to happen. And remember standing in Moraine Park at 10 o'clock at night, getting hit in the face by a 60-mile-an-hour, very dry, very warm wind, and not having a very encouraging feeling about what's coming next. So we all agreed to let people get a little bit more rest, and around 2 to 3 in the morning, we were going to start ordering in additional resources on top of what the incident management team already had in town. So about 2 a.m., we started putting out the call, utilizing a lot of our mutual aid existing relationships, as well as just personal relationships. Any chief whose cell phone number I had in my phone, going down the list, calling and asking what they could send. And by 8 o'clock in the morning, we had another 100 firefighters and 35 engines that we brought in to support what the incident management team had, got them organized into strike teams with leadership, and then handed them to the incident management team so they could report to the structural protection group, helping work along Highway 66, High Drive, Fall River Road, all of those areas that we anticipated were going to be impacted so that we could have as many resources here as possible. All through that day, now which had really started the day before for a lot of people, and people had not got much rest. That entire day, we kept waiting for the fire to hit town. Our original expectations that fire was going to be through the YMCA by around 6 a.m. and pushing the Moraine Elkhorn area by dinner, expecting snow to start sometime that night. And again, as we know in hindsight, the fire continued to hold up in Rocky Mountain National Park considerably longer than we predicted, which worked out to our favor. But we had the resources in place to be prepared for that. One of the most challenging times was going out and briefing those crews and talking with them about what we expected, and acknowledging that the way this fire had moved through Grand County, the way we had seen Cameron Peak move through Larimer County, there is no way you can stand in front of a fire like that and expect a good outcome. So our firefighters were being briefed to expect that they would have to shelter in a safe place, let the fire blow past, and then come in behind the fire to try and save whatever they could. And that was, it's a strategy called flame front following. It's utilized often enough to have a name. And that is what we expected that we were going to have to be doing all through Highway 66 and Moraine Avenue, letting the fire pass us and then doing what we could afterwards. Fortunately, that isn't what we had to deal with. The fire held up. Once it did push down into Moraine Park, resources tied with the incident management team with Rocky Mountain National Park were able to engage and utilize existing fuel breaks that Rocky Mountain National Park has been working on for decades to try and burn off of and hold the fire inside the park, hold it west of Bear Lake Road. And then by the time the snow started falling, the fire had only made it to Bear Lake Road within the park. And so by the time the snow fell, the East Troublesome fire had come within 1 mile of the YMCA. Cameron Peak had a big 1,200-acre blowout across Dunraven Glade Road, which came within 2 miles of the north end of our district. And so both fires had gotten pretty close to where our resources were, and both fires had passed our trigger points for evacuations. And then, unfortunately, with the snow, the chaos of that day didn't end there. The the snow started to fall. We had called in a number of resources to relieve our Estes Valley resources that had been going nonstop for a couple of days, and let them get some rest. I had a division chief from Loveland Fire that took over my role at the Emergency Operations Center. We had a chief from Fort Lupton that came up and served as our duty officer to handle any calls within the district. And we had an engine from Loveland that was out of our station handling any calls so our people could go home and get some sleep. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, we got a phone call about a reported wildfire on Prospect Mountain, which in the delirious state we were in, woke up and first thought is, how did East Troublesome make it all the way to Prospect in that time? And as once we got people there, we realized it was a house fire. And at risk of sounding flippant about it, it was almost a relief, like, oh, it's only a house on fire. Like, okay, we know how to handle that. It's not a wildfire that's now burned all the way through our town. But Loveland's engine was there, the Fort Lupton chief was there, Poudre Fire had a chief up here helping, and they were all working together on it, and every one of our volunteers that had been sent home to rest showed back up to help fight this fire. And it was around 4 o'clock in the morning. We had the fire under control. There's snow on the ground, lines are freezing, and so we were able to hand that fire off, actually, again, to one of the Denver crews that was up here staying at the Stanley. We were able to get them from the incident to help mop up the fire so that our crews could, again, go home and get some rest. And then after that fire, things did calm down considerably, and we were able to continue to monitor, work with the incident management team to see when we could start letting people back in. A lot of the work that really then started between the Emergency Operations Center and the incident had less to do with fighting the fire and more to do with the management and communication with our community. Eric Rose and I would have once a day, if not twice a day, Zoom calls with all the heads of special districts in the community, with the local marketing district, with the chamber, with the town, to brief people on where things stood and where we were at as far as evacuations, where we were at as far as communications, when were we ready to bring people back into the community, were we ready just for the local citizens to come back or to be open for business again, realizing that you have to have all the infrastructure to support that. So the water department's got to be able to keep up with that. The sanitation districts have to be able to ramp up. How are we going to feed people when we've evacuated Safeway? All of those things have to come into play. So there was a lot of planning that was going into not just evacuating people, but to bringing people back. Knowing that communities around us in Larimer County, Poudre Canyon had been evacuated for 2 months. Glen Haven had been evacuated for over a week, and we had been evacuated for about 72 hours. But of course, we're fielding the calls for when we were going to open things up and let people back in. So a lot of those conversations were happening. Taking a step back to some of the other things that were going on as we had the fire pushing into town, was a lot of coordination with the utility providers. So after we evacuate people out of a neighborhood, the next concern is if we have houses on fire, we don't want active gas lines and we don't want active power lines. So working with Estes Park Light and Power of when we could shut off electricity in an area where it makes sure that that area is safe for us, but it also keeps the crews safe because those crews are willing to go out and do very dangerous work, but it's not fair for us to ask them to go engage inside a fire zone. So we need to shut things off preemptively so that they can get out. Same with working with Excel, Energy, and the gas lines. Where can we shut things off? Where are natural points to break in the system? Realizing that, again, we are expecting a cold front to come through. So trying to shut those things off. One of the challenges that we ran into working with our water department is that the main water facility at that time of year is the Glacier Basin treatment plant. And so by shutting off power to Highway 66, we shut off power to the Glacier Basin treatment plant, which shuts off pressure to all of the fire hydrants. And fire hydrants were kind of important to us in fighting the fire, so we weren't interested in doing that. So we worked with the water department. They were able to move their pumping capacity over to the Marys Lake plant over the span of a couple of hours, something they typically do in the fall, and just expedited that process a little bit. So it was a lot of really good coordination between not just fire agencies and emergency agencies, but all of our utilities, all of our service providers, all of our community partners, both during and after the event, to help navigate the event as then to recover from it. Because we did have that snow, and now we've got thousands of homes without power, without gas, that are experiencing freezing temperatures, and we're worried about freezing pipes. And there's a little bit of the greatest risk at this moment is fire, and therefore we're going to shut these things off. And the next greatest future threat is the freezing, so we'll deal with that when we get to that. And then it was working with Excel, working with Light and Power to restore power as quickly as possible. Excel was really proactive about getting space heaters out to their customers, so if they couldn't restore gas in time, they were able to have some way of heating their homes. And of course, working with people to allow them back into the community to be able to winterize their home as best as they can, because when they evacuated, they weren't thinking about winterizing, they were just thinking about preserving life and their property and getting out. So a lot of communication, a lot of lessons learned that, again, hopefully we don't need to repeat, but a lot of after action that came out of that, of things that went well and areas where, should we ever be faced with these types of challenges again, who do we need to have in the room? How do we make sure that we make good decisions and set ourselves up for success?
How much time does that kind of equate to?
Yeah.
Of how close those actually were, if the distance isn't scary enough?
Sure. It depends on the fuel and it depends on the weather, are the main drivers, and topography and wind, and those things factor into that. To give some examples of things that have happened right here in Larimer County, the Fern Lake fire in 2012 burned about 3 miles in 45 minutes in December of 2012. Cameron Peak fire, when it blew out on October 14th, it went 18 miles over the course of a 12-hour period. And so we had a few days like that on the Cameron Peak fire where it went over 10 miles in a day, and sometimes it was traveling at 2 to 3 miles an hour as far as how quick the flame front was moving. And in Grand County, the East Troublesome fire, most of that growth happened after 5 p.m. So a lot of the miles that were covered between 5 and 10 p.m. at night. So multiple miles per hour is not unheard of in these types of fires. So 1 mile is way closer than any of us want. And as we're thinking about evacuation points, we're thinking about it backwards of how long is it going to take us to get everybody out of town if we have a full community during a Scott Fest weekend or during a Labor Day weekend. We can expect that to take north of 10 hours to evacuate everybody. So we want to drive out those trigger points 10 hours before the fire could reach us. And a lot of times you don't know the fire's coming yet because the fire hasn't started or the fire hasn't made it over the divide or whatever the threat is, which makes it really hard to have an orderly evacuation in the timeframes that we're presented with and timeframe we have available to us.
So knowing that, and you talk about the trigger points and everything else, is there ever a time where you would have to pull everybody out? All of the emergency responders and everything like that, and is there a trigger point for that?
Yes. Yeah, so the people managing those resources on the ground, the individual firefighters are responsible for paying attention to their conditions. The leadership, whether it's a strike team leader or task force leader or the division, is responsible for the safety of all of the people operating. And when we were operating down in Glen Haven, there were times that we pulled everybody out. We didn't know what the fire was going to do. We weren't sure that we had adequate safety zones or escape routes to make sure that we could safely move through that area should the fire do what it could have done. And so we pulled everybody out, reevaluated, and then re-engaged when it was safe to do so. And that's one of the hardest things about the people in those incident command roles or the division roles or those leadership roles is to find that balance between recognizing I have a dangerous job that has inherent risk, and the only way to be truly safe is to not engage at all. And at the same time, not being overly aggressive and overly foolhardy and charging in to a situation where your probability of success is low and your risk is excessively high. That's where you rely on experience, you rely on training, and you rely on the community of people to communicate with each other to say, you might feel okay about this, but I have concerns, and I'm comfortable bringing those up and sharing them with you, because then we can have this conversation, because you may not have seen those same things that triggered my concerns. And we can talk about why we're going to continue down this path or we're going to adjust course accordingly. Everybody has different experiences that have led them up to that moment. So Some people have seen fire do things that would give them pause, and other people maybe haven't had those same experiences, or they've operated in other parts of the country where things are different. So it's not directly applicable. And that's where that conversation is so important. The incident management teams that get brought in include all the way down through the divisions, and they are comfortable working with each other. They're bringing very experienced people who have traveled the country fighting large-scale fires. And you rely on the experts, and you rely on your own local knowledge and experience to make sure you're setting your people up for success.
Just to digress a little bit, with the East Troublesome fire, a lot of people were saying that this was the first ever known leap over the Continental Divide. Is that true to the best of your knowledge?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, because all of the conversations that those of us who are worried about the Estes Valley had about fires, whether it was the National Park, the U.S. Forest Service, or local agencies, we all looked at the divide as this wonderful fire break that we didn't have to worry about, that we could send people to evacuate up and over the divide to protect them, or we didn't have to worry about those fires over on the west side because they're going to get to the divide and stop, because the furthest known ember to start another fire that had been confirmed had been up to a mile. And the divide in that area is 1.5 miles wide, which should, 7,000 feet seems like it should be far enough. And this is where, as we've watched the frequency of large-scale fires, we've seen the fire behavior increase through the years, we've had experiences like this. We're recognizing that we all need to recalibrate on what is possible and how we plan on what could happen, while not going too far in the other direction where we're now evacuating the whole community just because there's an escaped campfire 30 miles away. There's still a sweet spot. And we saw some of those challenges for our partners to our north in Larimer County. Communities of Red Feather, Crystal Lakes, Glacier View were evacuated, let back in, evacuated, let back in. And that every time you yo-yo people in and out, fewer people evacuate the next time, and fewer people the time after that. So we don't want to cry wolf. We want to make sure that when we say evacuate, we mean it. We also don't want to be too late. And that's a difficult balance. And you make the best decision you can in the moment with the information you have. It's a lot easier to criticize those decisions after the fact when you have new information and you have the benefit of that hindsight. But there's a little bit of trusting that the people that are being burdened with that decision are making the best decision they possibly can with the information they have, to balance that need to keep the community safe and not be overly cautious and putting people at risk because you're trying to evacuate thousands of people down canyons. An evacuation isn't without its own risks. So there's always those conversations that are going on, and that's where the team aspect of it is so crucial, to have people that you can talk through these. I think we should evacuate. What do you think? Here's my logic. And working through those problems together.
I imagine then, you said you got these satellite images, these heat spots. Mm-hmm. I mean, how critical was it to get eyes on the fire to really verify it? And what does that truly mean? Is it somebody hiking back there to see it? You spotters with binoculars, or how did that take place?
Yeah, for that particular location, they tried both. They tried to send people by car up onto Trail Ridge Road where they could look across, but the smoke in the valley and Forest Canyon was so thick they couldn't confirm that there was fire. Had been so much smoke over the last couple of days blowing over the divide that it wasn't definitive. So it did end up being people hiking up into Forest Canyon, up past Cub Lake to confirm that there was fire. And then that drove our decisions moving forward about what to do next. While they were hiking, we were building our plans about, okay, if the fire has come over, these are going to be where we're going to draw our lines and when we're going to start evacuations. And by the time that we had confirmed that fire was over the divide, it was already past the first couple of lines that we had drawn on the map. And so that also sped things up, and why it appeared to escalate so quickly on the end of people receiving the notifications.
So I wanted to ask about the Emergency Operations Center a little bit that was at the Events Center. Generally speaking, what's the feeling there with everybody in there? I mean, you know, up, down, triumph, camaraderie, all of those things. But can you just give us some insight to what that what it was like for you to be in there with all these other individuals?
Yeah, when an emergency operations center first stands up, there's always a little bit of unease because of whatever event has precipitated the need to start and open an emergency operations center. It's something we've trained on, it's something we've talked about. It's not something we have to do often because most incidents don't get to that scale. So there's always a little bit of apprehension of like, okay, it's happening that we need to do this. We've trained for it, we've worked together, but now it's time. In some ways, I also had a bit of relief because you walk into the Emergency Operations Center and it's all people that you know, you have relationships with, you've trained with, and their confidence comes from, these are the people, if I have to face this kind of problem, these are the people I want to face it with. I'm not on my own trying to deal with something like this. And so early on, when things are just getting started, it's from the outside looking in, it probably looks a little chaotic, while there's a lot of energy happening because tables are getting shoved together, maps are getting thrown on the table, people are pointing at the maps and starting to throw out ideas. And usually there's a moment of clarity where the structure starts to take over of who's in charge, how are we gonna organize this, how are we gonna make our decisions about what needs to happen. And because a lot of those things had already been built into our plans years prior, they happen relatively quickly, and then we start to fall into the, okay, this is what we think our plan's going to be, how does everyone feel about that plan? And it's a mix between a democratic process and an authoritarian process where ultimately someone has to make the decision, but we're checking in with each other about that decision. Like, this is the decision, based on the input, this is the decision I'm prepared to make. Anybody have an objection, now's the time to speak up. And sometimes that's drawing where the line should be, that's actually making the decision to say, yes, we need to start evacuating. And then it's some rapid delegation of, we've made the decision to evacuate Highway 66. This individual is now gonna go work with the 911 authority to get that message out to those residents. These people are gonna go get the police officers and the firefighters to start making the door-to-door contacts. And the rest of us are going to stay here and start working on the next part of the plan, which is, great, we've evacuated to here. When do we evacuate to the next line? Let's update our trigger points. Let's update our understanding while trying to get information from the field of, we have a snapshot at a moment in time drawn on this map of where the fire is. Is that still accurate? Has the fire moved? We're making our evacuation plans based on assumptions about the weather. Are those still accurate? Has the weather changed? Has the forecast changed? And so you're working as a team to bring in all the necessary information, to filter through that information, to make the best decision you can, and then to execute that decision. A decision being made doesn't magically cause everybody to transplant out of that part of the neighborhood that's at risk. It's still then making sure that the messages get sent with the right information to the right people, and that there's the right follow-up so that we can then move on to the next decision without feeling like we've dropped something. The longer the EOC is open, the more we start getting settled into a rhythm. When we first opened the Emergency Operations Center, it was a handful of, starts with just 3-4 people and grows up to about 15 people that are really focused around that decision making. But over time, that really explodes. And if you've been in our event center, it's an incredibly large open area. The front of that open area was set up as the main command center, so you had tables for people running incident command and logistics and planning and finance and everything that goes into that higher level planning. And then you had Excel took over a whole corner of the building, and you had the incident management team establish themselves in a corner, and other resources start to take over some of those spaces, which is convenient because it's easy to interface. But it also makes it considerably louder because you have now dozens and dozens of people that are filling the space. Everybody's talking, everyone's carrying on their own conversation. You start thinking about getting food in and drink and supporting all of those people that are now in this space to realize who needs to get rotated out to sleep, who needs to have time to eat, when's the next time we're gonna have to make decisions. Over the course of the middle of the day on the 22nd, a lot of things were happening very quickly. And so you almost had to be forced to stop, to go grab a bite, to have a drink, because so many important decisions were being made. And then finally, by that evening, things start to slow down enough that people realize how tired they are. how exhausted they are from making some of these high stress decisions. And then we start coming up with our plans to how to maintain that for the duration of rotating out our public information officers. We're trying to push information out through the town, through the fire district, through other channels, and making sure that accurate information is going out, keeping people informed about what's going on, and making sure that stream continues 24/7 while recognizing that it's humans that are responsible for doing it. So, and everyone's got a breaking point. It was also especially challenging because our own families were being evacuated at the same time all of these things were happening. And we're trying to find a balance between making sure we're doing our job and making sure our families are cared for and that our fellow responder families are cared for. Because first responders are going to struggle to do their job if they're worried about their own families at the same time. And most first responder families have had those conversations, have had that kind of planning. Having lived in Houston while in the fire department, my wife and I had conversations before we even had kids about expectations that if we had a hurricane event and I was going to have to work, making sure that she and any dependents were out of that area before it hit so that I wouldn't have to worry about them. So I could know they were safe. Even if we thought maybe our home might be okay, we didn't want to worry about it. And it was the same sort of situation for East Troublesome, was making sure that my wife and 2 young children and dogs get loaded up and get out of town safely so that I can divert all of my energy to focus on the problem I need to manage for work now. But everybody's got different challenges, another working spouse, childcare or not, being able to get back to their homes so they can get their pets, so they can get their documents, so they can get whatever it is they need to, so that they can get their loved ones out. And that was a big part of that challenge on the 22nd, is finding the balance between we need this group of people here, but those people also are being pulled in other directions because of their loved ones and their other responsibilities. And with a volunteer fire department, that's always a challenge because of our 35 volunteers. Many of them work in roles where they're needed in their other role at the same time that we need them for this type of event. And finding the right way to make sure that their work responsibilities are being handled, the volunteer agency has what it needs to do, its job, but while everyone's loved ones are also being cared for. But that's where the community aspect really comes together. People looking out for each other. It's not every person for themselves. It's, okay, this person's gonna make sure all the volunteer firefighter families are taken care of and are going to the same evacuation center and have the support of each other that they need, instead of having to worry about, my wife being all on her own with, 2 kids under 7, and navigating that. So the team family atmosphere of those emergency service organizations really shines through at a time like that.
You mentioned rest a couple of times, rotating the teams out. You mentioned some that were over at the Stanley Hotel. Where were people going? Were they at the Emergency Operations Center, spread all over, going to personal homes, or how'd that look?
It varied. So the Stanley Hotel was housing people that were tied to the incident management team itself and were formerly part of the incident. For a lot of our first responders, it depended on where they lived. We had some people sleeping at the firehouse. We had some people trying to get rest at the Emergency Operations Center, but there was so much activity going on at the Emergency Operations Center that it never really settled down in any sort of useful way to get rest. Some people did go back to their homes depending on where they were in the community. They'd go to friends' houses, and different people were managing different parts of that. So while I was tied up at the Emergency Operations Center, focused on the evacuation piece, our operations chief, Paul Capo, was managing things at the firehouse, taking care of our members, making sure they had the resources they need. They were getting rest, they were getting food, they were being taken care of. Law enforcement had their own structure taking care of them. And similarly with different organizations, each organization was sort of taking care of their own people as we tried to formalize that through the Emergency Operations Center of what does everyone need logistically? If we need food delivered to a certain location, let's get that so we can bring it and everybody has access to it. Some of the challenges that we were facing during the incident and then continuing was our community is incredibly generous and wanted to help and wanted to bring water, food, meals, and it was getting it from the people who wanted to donate it to the people who needed it, because sometimes we'd have only 10 people at the firehouse, but then pallets of food would be brought there and we need to distribute it to other places. So That's where we leaned on a lot of our other partners in the community to help us with some of those things and help manage some of that generosity so that it actually got off our plate and we could focus on some of the other things that we needed to do. We worked really closely with Flinch Forward and the American Legion as organizations to help us be a clearinghouse for donations for first responders that we're helping. Estes Park Nonprofit Resource Center and the American Red Cross did a lot of the facilitation for things that were coming in for civilians and citizens. And the Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Corporation, EDC, were both helping manage things for businesses and supporting those businesses. So then we could have heads that were again, sort of those clearinghouses for donations, clearinghouses for making sure that people got what they needed, and helped alleviate some of that off the incident management team and the team that was running the Emergency Operations Center to make sure that people got the support without us having to be in the weeds of managing those logistics while we're also trying to not freeze pipes and other things.
So, I know that there are a lot of other fire crews assisting with this. Do you recall where they were from or where the furthest ones came from?
The incident management team that came in brought resources from all over the country. At its peak, the Cameron Peak Fire had 1,100 firefighters assisting all over Larimer County. And I believe at max we had around 400 firefighters in the Estes Valley that were working everything from Storm Mountain to Glen Haven on the southern side of Cameron Peak to the East Troublesome, Thompson Zone on our side of the divide. So all over the country, they would be ordered up. The teams we had a Pacific Northwest team, a Southwest team that came from Arizona, teams from all over the place that came in to manage it, and then the crews from all over. One of the amazing things when you think about these incident management teams is each team only works for 14 days, which means in a 14-day span, they stand up an 1,100-person company that they have to feed, house, equip, pay, support them through the strategic vision that's been given to them that they tweak in their time, deliver on those objectives, and then after 2 weeks, have this massive transfer of knowledge over to the new team, and then they leave and a new team comes in and continues running it. And so if you can imagine just what it takes to run a business of that scale at that kind of stakes in those time frames, it was always impressive to me. I believe we had 9 incident management teams over the course of the Cameron Peak Fire. So a lot of relationships built very quickly, a lot of trust had to be established very quickly so that you could then accomplish what you needed to and then start all over with the new team 2 weeks later. And every time you're still dealing with your community, but they come in, they do their time, and then they move on. So so all over the place, there were just tons and tons of people that cycled through.
And then that leads into the next question. All of this is taking place while we have COVID-19 and a world pandemic happening. How does that influence it, play into it? How big of a concern for that was there in the EOC?
Yeah, COVID-19 started here for us in Colorado back in March of 2020. And so by the time Cameron Peak had started, we were 5 months into COVID. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of changing protocols and precautions, trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. Fire service is a hard job to do remotely, so it was one that we needed to try and figure out and navigate all through the summer. As a fire district, we are uniquely partially funded by sales tax, and decreased tourism in the Estes Valley means decreased revenues for the fire district. Which was one thing we were trying to navigate while our people are also dealing with updating protocols and these risks. Am I putting myself as a volunteer at risk of getting an exposure and taking it home to my family? So there's a lot of the stresses of COVID that wore on all summer long and wore on all of us, business owners that volunteer with us and their impacts to their businesses, that didn't magically go away because things started catching on fire. If anything, we took all of that uncertainty and that angst and then built on it with the fires. When we had the fires starting back in August, we were trying to observe COVID spacing, masking, keeping people just with their crews so that we didn't have spread from crew to crew and not having to isolate large groups of people. But the Cameron Peak fire had a number of COVID exposures throughout the incident, positive cases, people hospitalized, exposure from crew to crew. That was an ongoing threat all through the 2020 wildfire season, not just in Colorado, but nationally. Especially, as I mentioned, we had crews from all over the country. So people coming from different parts of the country with different protocols, different levels of concern for how they wanted to treat COVID in their area, and bringing all of that together and then putting hundreds of people with different ideas about what COVID meant and how to handle it together. So it was a big challenge all through this fire. And then once we reached East Troublesome coming over the divide and some of the things going on for us, it was trying to find that balance between the COVID risks and the job that needed to be done. We couldn't all Zoom in together to plan an evacuation for a community. We needed to be together around a table. So making sure people are wearing masks, maintaining distances where you can, or accepting we're now in a bubble together for the next couple of weeks. And if one of us gets sick, we're all likely getting sick. We were mentioning the challenge with evacuations and the increased COVID risk that posed for our citizens. We recognize that having people stay in their homes if we're worried about fire coming into town has its own set of risks, and sending people away from the community to all go to a hotel together down in the Front Range poses other risks. And we did see our COVID numbers increase in our community after the evacuation, most likely because of the fact that people had to travel together, shelter together, and then come out of their bubbles that they were in their homes to then have to survive at grocery stores and restaurants and things down in the Front Range. And that was a tough decision because you knew neither decision was without risk. It wasn't, this is a risky choice and this is the non-risky choice. It was two different levels of risks, both of which had uncertainty with them. And then as a group, trying to make the best decision you can about how to manage it. So at that point, we had no vaccines. That wasn't on the table. So it was absolutely part of the conversation about how can we safely operate, who needs to be part of this group, who doesn't need to be part of this group, how do we minimize our risk while recognizing we have a job to do for our firefighters, for our emergency operations staff, and then ultimately how we interfaced with all those other teams.
With the idea of getting these evacuation calls out with LEDA and just the idea of information dissemination, how did you go about doing that, especially in a community of our size, a community that has an older population, where you're not sure who all has cell phones, digital access, things like that?
Yeah, sort of two types of communication that we were primarily concerned about. One was emergency notifications about we need you to evacuate, voluntary evacuations, critical time-sensitive information. And for that, the challenge that we have are locals and tourists, because our locals have the option to be signed up for NOCO alerts and emergency alerting, which we have a relatively high percentage of 30%. We would always love to see that number grow, but that's one of the challenges that we have is getting those messages out. So working with LEDA is the Larimer Emergency Telephone Authority. That's the 911 authority for the county. And we have a couple of tools that we can use to both alert people who are signed up as well as push notifications to people who are not signed up, which is how we make sure that anybody visiting the valley that has cell service gets a notification. So the first is trying to get people notified on things like that. And then it's also the continued notification. So also with emergency notifications, we're doing door-to-door. The sheriff's office, his goal is to make sure they touch every door in the district during an evacuation. So they knock on the door, they make sure the person understands that the evacuation's been ordered, and then move on to the next house. So in addition to phones and text messages and other emergency alerts that are pushed out, it's also trying to have a human go to that address and make sure that person knows about the emergency notification. The other piece is the continued updates. People want to know what's going on. They leave town, they want to know, has my house been impacted? Is this place that I love to visit been burned? And so some of that is utilizing social media, doing interviews with news channels, spreading information whatever way we can. The hardest part with that is to maintain a consistent message between all the agencies, because the incident management team is officially responsible for the incident. So they have a communications plan, a communication strategy, communication figurehead, but there's also trust with the people that you know in your community. So people would rather hear it from their own town government, from their own fire department, from those people. So we stand up what's called a JIC, a Joint Information Center, that gets all those people together to talk about what is our message, what is important for us to communicate, who's sending things out through which channels, are we missing anything, so that the public information officer for the town, for the fire district, for the park, for the incident are all on the same page and making sure that that information is getting pushed out. We worked really hard to keep information up to date on our social media and having that be shared so people could understand what was happening as it was evolving, trying to make sure that we were addressing misinformation that was out there, because well-intentioned people would share something that wasn't wholly accurate, and some of which is harmless and some of which can lead people to think, oh, it's okay to go back, or it's okay to stay in this area, when that isn't what we wanted people to take away from that message. So it's a delicate balance between engaging on those to identify misinformation, but also just to be the trusted source of information to say, here's the official word on what's going on. No matter what else you read, this is the official record, and this is what people need to know. And that trust doesn't start when the fire starts. That trust starts well ahead of the incident, of being a consistent source of trustworthy information and making sure that you're pushing those out and utilizing all the means that we can. Hand-delivered newspapers wasn't happening in Estes Park during that time, so we did really have to rely on digital media and then news, cable news and TV news, other local news channels doing interviews.
So it takes a lot of people to make all of this happen, and how well you all manage this. Are there any individuals you'd like to recognize for this interview here?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I want to recognize Eric Rose. He and I have done a lot of communicating and planning leading up to this event. He was a phenomenal partner through the event, and someone that I knew I could lean on and bounce ideas off of. And so he is someone that I've worked very closely with in my time in Estes, and I know that our relationship has really benefited a lot of the things that worked and helped us identify what things we need to do better on and which things we need to improve, so that if we ever faced with this sort of thing again, we can address those shortfalls. Some of the other people there's an incredible list of people that I would love to acknowledge. Everybody that had the foresight to plan for an event like this, starting with Mike Llewellyn from Rocky Mountain National Park. Coming back, it would have been easy to take that event in Tennessee and brush it off as a one-off, instead of saying, what parallels can I tie to my own community? How can I make sure that I don't have something like that happen in my community, or if I do, that I'm as prepared as possible for it? Certainly everybody that is part of the fire district that stepped into different roles, everyone was really stretched during that incident. On smaller incidents, it's easy to say, okay, well, that's going to roll up to the fire chief or the ops chief, and they're going to handle it. And we were getting pulled in so many different directions that people were forced into roles that maybe they weren't comfortable with at that time, but they recognized there's no one else to do it, and so it's got to be me, because we need to make these things happen. Of all of our volunteers that we had active during those fires, every single one was present helping us fight those fires. The only two people who were unable to help us were working as a park ranger and as a dispatcher, so we're going to let them off the hook. But everyone else was able to be there, and everyone that could showed up. And that's what you hope for out of your agency, is that when it comes time, when the chips are down and you really need to step up, that everyone will. And everyone really showed that they were willing to do that. So every agency had their key players that really made things happen. Those relationships between our agencies is what made a lot of the successes happen and set us up to be able to grow from the things that didn't go well, because we'll be the first to acknowledge that there were things that could have been better, could have been different. And it was a situation none of us had ever faced before. And so we expect some of those things, and now we recognize them, and we're not too proud to learn from them and make sure that we can be better. We got a grant through the International Association of Fire Chiefs that came in late 2020 that included an evacuation drill for a community, how to prepare for something like that, which was scheduled for April of 2021. We were one of the few agencies to go through a grant like that that have already had the experience of doing it by the time you do the drill. But even having had the experience 6 months earlier, everybody showed up from the fire district to the police department to the sheriff's office to the town to participate in this conversation. And it was a great opportunity to really do an after action of what happened in 2020 and to recognize where we were good and where we were lucky, and to say, okay, we didn't have to evacuate the school last time. Let's make sure we have a plan so that if that has to happen, we're prepared. Learning from things like a lot of agencies in town were expecting to be able to use school buses should they have a major incident at their facility, which is a very reasonable thing to expect until the entire community is evacuated at one time. And there's only so many school buses to go around. So those sorts of things were great topics to be able to bring up. And because of the relationships, people were willing to come to the table and talk about them and be open about, okay, we missed this one, how do we make it better?
What other stories are there or antics that you'd like to share? I mean, either something that you heard or just some of your personal experiences of going through both of these fires as well.
I think the biggest challenge that I experienced, and I think was not unique to me, but was shared by a lot of people in our community, was dealing with uncertainty for an extended period of time. We had been dealing with COVID with no certain end date, with no certain solution, and now we had a fire in August that had jumped Highway 14, and there's nothing really to stop it between Chambers Lake and Estes Park, but it's miles and miles away, and so it's uncertain if it's going to get to us. And all summer, the theme of last year was uncertainty. We don't know what our sales tax revenue is going to look like, and being able to fund some of the things that we think are important projects, to uncertainty in people's businesses, uncertainty in what's going to happen with my kid's school. And all of that uncertainty compounded all year long. And so then by the time the fire jumped the divide, there was, I think for some, a moment of clarity. We're like, okay, it's not uncertain anymore. I know exactly what I need to do. This is not the situation I hoped for, but at the same time realizing that I can move from an uncertain mindset of fearing that uncertainty to I can apply what I was trained to do, I know needs to happen. Which then just introduced more uncertainty of things that we had never had to face before, of evacuating communities, of dealing with supporting all of our resources, supporting all of our people over that kind of duration. That uncertainty really weighs on people, as you can imagine, and you're second guessing your decisions as you try and get through those tough patches. And that's where relying on the people around you to support each other, to help you make good decisions, to help them make good decisions so that we can have the best possible outcome. And realizing that if we make a bad decision, that we made it together and we're going to be able to support each other through that. But that uncertainty was, for me, I think most acute the night that we called in all our help and we were expecting the fire to push out of the park into the town before the snow arrived, because I got the call that we needed to go out, and I'm walking out of my house and the wind's blowing and it just feels ominous in the air because of how dry it is. And I remember glancing at my house and wondering if I was going to see it again as I then got in my truck and went to work. And I'm sure it's an experience a lot of people had last year, and a lot of people remembered the first time smoke was in the air this summer. And so I'm not sure how long it'll be until that memory fades, but for now it's still pretty crisp in my mind about that uncertainty that was all along the way, all through last year, and still continues to this day.
From a professional point of view, how high up in memorable fires do you think the East Troublesome and Campbell Peak fires will be?
I hope I never have an experience that tops it. So yes, I again, it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it's hard to beat the top two fires in state history converging on your community at the same time. Like I said, at this point in time, I can't imagine something that will top that, but I didn't imagine this one, so check back with me in a few years.
What are the most important lessons, or the lesson even, that we have learned from this incident, I guess, as a community? Mm-hmm. And then is there anything that you can specifically remember that you would have done differently? Or is it mostly just in hindsight?
Sure. So with regard to the first question, the most important lessons for me from the fire was how important relationships are and as much prior planning as possible. So the relationship piece is not waiting until the incident to build the relationships, not waiting to get to know the players, because you're going to be relying on each other, you're going to be collaborating and working together in a high stress situation that requires trust, and trust can't be built after the emergency starts. So it's building those relationships early on. And the planning piece is bringing us a bit of pessimism to the table of how bad could it be? Are we prepared? Really being critical with your own personal capabilities, your own agency's capabilities, your community's capabilities, and dealing with a problem like that, so that when you identify those shortfalls, you can start working on them. Again, not waiting until the emergency to realize, I wish I had done this. Hopefully you go into that. And there's a great quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower about planning, which is that plans are useless, but planning is invaluable. And that proved to be very true during these incidents, where the scenario we had prepared and built wasn't the scenario that happened. But going through that process, built the relationships, identified the weak spots, identified the improvement areas that we needed, so that when Cameron Peak and East Troublesome came together, we had a lot of those things in place. As far as things that wish we had known or could have done better, there's always things in hindsight that you recognize, like, oh, that could have been better. I think that the single biggest thing that came out of it was realizing we didn't plan long enough. We planned for the scale of incident that we had, but our plans held up for the first 24 hours. And then we realized, okay, not only have we evacuated every restaurant in town, we've evacuated the only grocery store in town. We have 150 people that have remained as critical staff. How are we going to feed them? Who's going to relieve them when they're tired? Who's going to step into my role in the Emergency Operations Center when I'm too exhausted to stand up? And it's easy to plan the emergency and think the emergency will be over in that time frame without realizing that even with adrenaline, you're going to hit a wall eventually. And I think that was the biggest takeaway, is that we need to make sure that we have a plan that is going to rotate people through, is going to have more depth in that structure, so that if I'm on vacation, I'm not available, someone else knows exactly what I knew and could step into that role. It was always that balance between it's better to be lucky than good, and it's best to be both. And we had a lot of things that went our way during this incident that helped us, and making sure that we're not relying on luck as a strategy, that we have a plan that's going to hold up to any challenge we might face.
What do you think that Estes Park as a community needs to do in the future for fire mitigation or fire planning?
The first is to acknowledge that the wildfire threat isn't going away anytime soon. We are going to see large-scale fires continue to be more frequent, not necessarily year to year, but over the course of a span of years. The 20 largest fires in state history have happened in the last 20 years, and 15 of them happened in the last 10 years, and 4 of them happened last year. They're becoming more frequent, they're becoming larger. The 3 largest fires in state history were Pine Gulch, which then was quickly overwhelmed by East Troublesome and Cameron Peak as first and second. And so we're seeing this threat continue. And so the main thing that our community needs to acknowledge is that this threat is increasing, so what can we do about it? That we can take a proactive role, starting at the individual level of doing things to make sure our homes are prepared, following things like ready, set, go principles to make sure your house is ready, that you understand what you need to do if you were ordered to evacuate. Educating our fellow citizens in our community, our neighbors, our other homes around us about those threats, and educating our tourists and our guests that are coming to this area that may not be aware of that threat because they come from a different part of the country that they don't have to deal with it. So there's some personal responsibility in how we can prepare ourselves. The other is the collective community responsibility, that where we need to come together and recognize that our federal partners have been doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to fuel mitigation and preparation work and prevention work. And we should be bearing some of that burden on the private side of the line to make sure that we're working together to accomplish some of those things to keep our community safer, to be looking at how we can help one another to be successful should we have an incident like that. Some of those are projects that are ongoing. Some of those are projects that will be figured out in the future as far as what's the right thing that needs to be done. But recognize there's both the personal responsibility piece and the community responsibility piece.
Is there anything else you'd like to share while we're here?
Yeah. I think the two things that stood out really both have to do with how the community came together during a time of disaster. And I wasn't here during the floods in 2013, but I've heard about how the community came together during those times, and we got to see that again in 2020. During the evacuations, at a time when I'm sure everybody was experiencing a ton of anxiety and uncertainty and stress, everyone was incredibly civil and was letting people into their lane and merging orderly as they're all looking at orange skies at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, feeling very ominous, and yet everyone is taking their time and being patient and supporting one another. And then the incredible outpouring of generosity that came after the evacuation was over, and people immediately pivoted to how can I help? And having a sense of community of I want to be part of the solution, I want to be engaged however I can, whether it was people calling and offering their heavy equipment or calling to offer to help haul livestock, or simply I can cook meals, where should I bring them? So a lot of people stepping up and really working together to support each other. And it's always great to see, and you always hope it doesn't take a major natural disaster to pull that out of people, but we know it's there. So that was definitely one of the greatest things to watch and witness.
I think that's it. Thanks so much for your time.
Sounds good. And we're right on schedule.